Hello, and thank you very much indeed for joining us for this first edition of Mobile Minds, a new webinar series in which we'll be exploring the trends and topics shaping the future of mobility. Well, mobility as we know it today is undergoing one of the greatest transformational shifts the industry has ever seen, with fundamental implications for the way we all live our lives. Well, we're here today in the new studios at Transdev's headquarters here in Paris for the very first edition of what we hope will be monthly, insightful and thought-provoking discussion with interesting experts and thought leaders in mobility. Today we're looking at the subject of sustainable mobility, and in particular what light COP26 has cast on this subject. We want to find out, what will the eventual greening of world cities mean? As cities get greener, will they necessarily get smarter? And also, what has the COVID pandemic changed with regards to the future of world cities? So we've got lots to discuss today, and I'm delighted to welcome to the studio Cécile Maisonneuve, who is a COP26 advisor and chairman of the urban innovation think tank La Fabrique de la Cité, and who is also currently senior advisor to the Center for Energy Climate at IFRI. That is the French Institute of International Relations. Cécile is also currently the president of Decisive and a member of the Montaigne Institute. A very warm welcome to you. We're also joined by Thierry Mallet, who is the chairman and the CEO of Transdev Group. So a warm welcome to you as well. Thank you both very much for joining us. Let me start by talking about COP26, since it was quite recent. What emerged from COP26, Cécile, that is going to have an impact on urban life and transportation?
Yes, well, COP26 in Glasgow was heavily criticized for delivering little results. Well, I totally disagree with this, because for me there are four major outcomes when it comes to the consequences of COP26 on urban life. First, it is definitely a very strong timing which was given by the world leaders at COP26. We have 1 decade to act. It's not 2050, 2060, it is this decade. Second, it's a philosophy of action. The COP26 say that we had to deliver a fair and just transition. And when it comes to fairness in cities, it has a lot to do with mobility. Third point, the COP26 said that we have to do three things. We have to scale up solutions, we have to accelerate, and we have to disseminate. So this is a kind of plan of action, really. And fourth, not least, COP26 delivered a very strong commitment about phasing out inefficient fuel subsidies. What does it mean? It means that the electrification of our lives is increasing, and especially electrification of mobility.
Thanks for that, Cécile. Thierry, is there anything you'd like to add to what she said?
Yeah, no, I think that there is a significant challenge for transport as part of the COP26, because transport is 25% of the emissions. It has been growing for the last few years, never decreasing. So it's an area where we definitely need to make a big effort, and we have, as mentioned by Cécile, 10 years to act. So we need to start now, and we see two ways of acting in transport. It's more shared mobilities. It's new offers where we can take people away from their cars. At least we can offer them an alternative to the car, so they don't have to use their car, but they can use public transport as a solution, and we are working on that. And the second one is our ability also to change the way we move ourselves with our vehicles by going into more electrical fleets, more hydrogen fleets, which are the way forward as well.
So how do we do this? How do we go about installing sustainable and inclusive mobility despite the fact that cars remain so dominant in our cities?
Well, Thierry said the word, alternatives. With a car, what do we have? We have easy, simple, practical way of moving around. You have to target this. You have to deliver solutions which are easy, practical, and very simple to use. People don't use their car because they're addicted to car. I don't believe in this. When you look at how people move every day, when you offer them very reliable alternative solutions, they do use them. Why do we in Paris, we're in the Transdev studio here in Paris, why do we use so little our cars? Modal share of cars in Paris is really low. as opposed to public transportation or walking. It's because we have a lot of solutions. It's not because we are more virtuous when we live in Paris, not at all. Because we can rely on other solutions. So this is what we have to deliver in our cities, in the city centers, but also in the peripheral areas of cities.
When you look at kilometers, for instance, in France, the modal share of the cars is around 83%. So it's a very significant share. But we can clearly reduce it. Of course, cars will become electrical, that will be part of the solution, and we need to find solution, alternate for the car, especially for the suburbs. As mentioned, that's where the biggest issue is today. We don't have enough solution, enough offer in the suburbs, and at Transdev we are currently working on developing specific solution for the suburbs. Can be a practical alternate to a car, so people don't have to use their car all the way, but at least for part of the way.
In city centers, what we see around the world for the moment is little by little. First, a diesel car banning, but in some cities already a car banning in the very heart of city centers. I'm thinking about Oslo in Norway, for example. As you know, in Norway there are many electrical vehicles, but there are making car disappearing in the city center of Oslo. Why? First, because it's easy to do. As we just said, in the city center you have many people, much density, and then it's easy to build other solutions. And second reason why they do this is because what is very scarce in cities is square meters. And the idea of delivering new public space for people, for other activities than driving, for leisure, for culture, or even for retail, is an idea which makes sense from an economic point of view. So when you have scarce public space, which is the case in dense city centers, it makes sense to dedicate it to other things than cars. So it's what we see in more and more cities, and this will increase in the coming decade, definitely.
Okay, so picking up on this theme of timing and time frame, does a carbon neutral life in the near term sound realistic to you?
Near term, no, definitely no. As you have seen, the commitments are made from a major part of the world for 2050, and for major countries such as China, it's 2060, India said 2070. So we all live in the same world, whether the CO2 molecule is emitted in Paris or in Beijing or in Timbuktu, it is the same impact for everybody. So we won't build this carbon neutrality just between us. We have to do it all around the world. So it's not a near-term possibility, but we have to act now, because what we're talking about, for example, when we talk about electrifying mobility, we're talking also about charging infrastructure. We're talking about a new geography of those kind of infrastructure. So it requires some time to be built, some planification, and also some understanding of the new patterns of mobility, which has been rather shaken by the pandemic.
No, I fully agree with the fact that we need time. All the solutions are not available. When I look at, for instance, hydrogen, we have about 50 vehicles. We are working on it. It's still not ready to be deployed globally. Maybe in 4 or 5 years it will be available, and that's what we are doing today by testing the solutions. And we know that there might be other solutions. We strongly believe that biogas as well is a good solution, is a good transition energy within the transition itself, in order to be able to have a cleaner way of moving around until we have hydrogen available. So we believe that we need time in order to be able to have a first renewable electrical energy everywhere. There will be also the need to change the way we behave, the way people are moving. I think that there is also a matter of trying to reduce the need of mobility. I'm not in favor of demobility, but we see that maybe a lot of way we move around, a lot of way we live could be reduced by different organization of the urbanism and the density of where we place. Coming back to the suburbs, we see that we have built in some areas very low density area. We can really improve the situation by reducing the need of mobility, and so people can move from forced mobility to chosen mobility, and that would be already a plus, but that will take time as well.
So far, the names of 2 cities have come up in this conversation, Oslo and Paris. When it comes to looking at role models, are there any role model cities out there that really catch your eye and you think they have got it exactly right?
It's that each city has its own DNA because it's a certain geography, a certain history, a certain urban shape, I would say. You have cities with large suburbs and very dense city centers, and already mentioned Paris, but you have also cities with more distributed geography. So I don't think there is one fits in all solution. It doesn't exist. We have to forget about this. We will have to be very inventive in each city. Of course, when it comes to transportation, very often we talk about the example of Singapore. For sure, it's a very efficient transportation model, but is it replicable in other geographies? This is the question. We can inspire ourselves from what we see outside, but we can't replicate exactly what we see in those geographies, for example. What I would like to insist on when it comes to what can we do in our cities, successful cities, their first quality is to be earnest, to be very constant in their policy. Let me take another example, which is about housing, affordable housing. And another ingredient, recipe of the ideal city would be the capacity of different players, well, to play together. Business, decision makers, and academics, it's rather a strong coalition when they decide to act together.
Okay, Thierry, any cities catch your eye as far as role models?
Yes, I have an idea, but it's not a city itself. It was designed by the city, but it's a model. It's what is happening in Bogota. In Bogota, in 5 years, and it comes back to 20 years ago, we were able to deploy, or the city was able to deploy a bus rapid transit system covering almost half of the city. Now it covers the full city in 20 years. And with buses, they are able to transport every day 2.5 million people. So it's just amazing what they have been able to do. And by doing that, they have taken away, I would say, some streets from the cars, which means that the share of the cars is very limited, and it's probably 20 to 30% at most.
Our cities are getting smarter around the world. I think that's something everyone agrees on. What's the role of transport and transportation systems in a smart city? Let me start by asking you.
Well, a sustainable transportation system has a powerful transformative effect. We just talked about Bogota, and we can apply this general rule to this example. First, it delivers accessibility to training, to education, to jobs. Second, it creates decent jobs and decent local jobs. It's really a powerful instrument. And in smart cities, what is interesting, smart cities are about efficiency. So you not only enable those transportation systems to bring all those benefits, but you accelerate also the effect of the new transportation model. I would say it's like a snowball effect which comes to feed other social policies taken by the cities.
I think that we should rather speak about green city rather than smart cities. I think that digital doesn't mean you're green or not green. We speak about probably sustainable city rather than green. Green is only a color, sustainable is a long-term and a better vision of what we should look. And I think digital has a role to play into sustainability, but not only digital.
And it clearly shows that smart for sure, increasing our digital technologies for sure, but for what goal? What is the meaning of all those smart devices we're using? What they're building, for example, in Singapore is a new science city where they definitely decided to use a lot of smart devices, but all targeted to improve our climate goals.
Do cities, do you think, look at each other and think, how could we learn? How could we be more like Singapore? Or how could we be more like Oslo? Is that happening? And if so, in what sort of forum does that happen?
Well, they do indeed, because cities are in a very interesting relationship. They are observing each other because they are not only cooperating but also competing. You know, today, when you look at, for example, in Europe, Paris, London, and other cities, they are really trying to attract not only investors, but also new inhabitants. So it's a good way, I think, to trigger innovation, to trigger new ideas. But they're also collaborating, and you have very prominent network of cities. The main one is certainly the C40. In the C40, it's a huge network which represents about 100 cities in the world. They are not only exchanging ideas, they are also creating coalition for a dedicated goal, for example, climate, for example, a better way of dealing with waste, and they are on the constant move.
We manage a few organizations where our clients, our city clients are getting together, and it's rather a place to exchange ideas, as you mentioned. Even if they compete at some point in time, they also are willing to learn from each other in order to be sure that they adapt the best solution in their field. And they're not just looking at climate. Climate is one important aspect. And as you mentioned, with COP26 comes the idea of fairness. This energy transition, this climate program needs to be inclusive, because we have to be very careful. When we start banning vehicles from the city centers, when we start doing that type of things, we may exclude part of the population. So it's very important that we have an inclusive view of the way we move, and cities have to take care of their suburbs. We have to ensure that they have a global way of doing it, which brings everybody on board and will not exclude part of the population or part of the countries in the scheme. So I think it's a very important one, and I think that we need, I would say, smart climate and inclusive solutions, or inclusive and smart cities. I would say, I think it's very important that the idea of inclusion remains a key element in the way we look at the future.
Part of inclusion and fairness is being realistic and accepting that we all breathe the same air, and therefore it's in the interests of richer cities and richer countries to help poorer ones, given that ultimately the atmosphere is the same for all of us.
Yeah, definitely. When we look at what's happening currently in the world in terms of urbanization, the main feature of urbanization is, what do we build currently in the world? We are building slums. This is the main feature of urbanization in the world. We have to be realistic about this. We are building slums in some cities, and in many cities at the same time we are building gated communities. So what Thierry said about inclusiveness, the necessity of bringing everybody on board when it comes to cities is absolutely key, because basically at the end of the day, why do people want to live in a city? Because this is a place where they will find new opportunities for building their personal life, meeting somebody, creating families, but also building professional opportunities. And if we don't deliver cities with, I would say, the capacity to be inclusive, which means transportation, which means public spaces, we will fail in making those cities fulfill the dream of the people who join them.
And with regards to that fairness and inclusion, Thierry, anything you'd like to add to what Cécile just said?
Yes, I have a good example, which is again the city of Bogota. We are going back to Bogota, where you have plenty of slums surrounding the cities. And in order to connect the slum, they have developed a program of cable cars, and we managed the first one in Bogota, which is able to allow people to access to the city in 10 minutes. And before, it took them 45 minutes to an hour to be able to get to the city, because there is no roads in those informal areas. So that's a significant milestone, and we are very proud to be managing it. And I think it's a very good example to be followed in other places as well.
Let's turn our eye to the COVID pandemic. It's come up a little bit in conversation already, but obviously the COVID pandemic has had a huge impact on the lives of pretty much every human being in every city around the world. To what extent do you think the pandemic accelerating things we were already doing, pre-existing behaviors in urban life? What are your thoughts, Cécile?
The demand for well-being, for health in cities was very strong before the pandemic. And today, no need to say that it is top number one demand from citizens. So this is what we have to deliver when we build new urban services. Second point I would like to mention is that we often talk about cities in terms of how space is organized, how you locate the places where people are living, how you locate places where people are working. But for citizens, a city is about how you organize your time. And what this pandemic has brought, in my view, is a great questioning from all of us about how do I organize my time? How do I want to organize my time? So from that point of view, the city we knew where everybody moved at the same time with the same schedule is definitely out of the landscape. Now we have to think about the cities as places where people will be willing to organize their own time at their own rhythm. And it has huge consequences for mobility, of course, because it means at the same time efficient but also more individualized way of thinking about mobility services.
We've seen people, of course, not using public transport as much as they did in the past. There was a few good reasons, because they were working from home, because they decided to go for walking or using their bike instead of taking public transport, which was a way to be at least in their mind protected against potential contamination, because the public transport unfortunately was seen as a place where you could get contaminated. Clearly the positive thing that we saw is that people are using more their bikes and more walking, and we are working with that as well in order to interface better our public transport with bike, especially with bike parks, with places you can park your bike and take into the public transport. So we use the bike not only to go all the way, but for the first and last mile. So it's something on which we are working today, and that's something very positive. So we are again moving maybe from forced mobility into more chosen mobility.
I think that, as Thierry said, when people come back from work or from the places where they have things to do, they will ask for, I would say, a mobility which is the daily mobility with a kind of soft mobility, with proximity services. And I guess that we will see two patterns cohabitating. First pattern about proximity, about slow movement, about walking, biking, some little shuttles, you know, to do the daily things you have to do around your house. And the second pattern will be a kind of pattern of speed efficiency. So it's a kind of tension between an urbanism of proximity, which is clearly demanded, green and easy to live, which brings well-being and health, and an urbanism of speed, where it's about efficiency, connectivity, and especially for the people who have chosen and will remain so after the pandemic to leave the city centers and, let's say, live two lives, working a bit in the city centers and living in secondary cities or middle-sized cities, for example. They will ask for huge connectivity, mobility connectivity with the large city centers.
We all know people, don't we, who've decided city life is no longer for them. They're going to move to a city nearby or another town and come into the city centre less often. So do you think that's just a passing trend, or do you think it's long-lasting?
There is a trend for sure, which only concerns a minority of people, white collars, people who have the possibility to have two homes as well, who decide not to leave the city, but to leave the very large city centers of metropolises to go either in, I would say, smaller cities within the periphery of the city, or would choose to go to a secondary city, but well connected with train, with mobility infrastructure. So we see this trend for sure, but at the same time, let's be realistic, jobs are in city centers. And this won't change in the, let's say, in the upcoming decade.
We see people moving into secondary cities, and they expect the same level of service they used to have in large cities, so which is a very good news for us, because we need to increase our level of service. They want to be able not to use their cars, so that's something where we can take advantage of. But they will still have to go to the large city, because that's where the job will remain, and so they will also need great connection and good connection to the large cities, and that's something also where we can act and interact.
We are urban people, we will remain urban people, with at the same time a demand for green, a demand for efficiency, and a demand, I would say, for a good use of our time, and hence a demand for efficient mobility services, definitely.
Thank you very much indeed to Cécile Maisonneuve and also to Thierry Mallet. Thank you for your time today. And thank you to you for being with us. We look forward to discussing further mobility issues with you in our next edition of Mobile Minds. Bye for now.